On the defeats exactly 43 years ago, on December 24, 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan. This article on the geography of Afghanistan and what happened to foreign forces in BC was first published in August 2021 and is being republished for today. What is there in Afghanistan that the whole world knows as the graveyard of empires? After all, why did all the great powers of the world, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, fail in their efforts to conquer it? This is a question whose answer is hidden in the history of Afghanistan and its geographical location. In the 19th century, the British Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at that time, tried to conquer it with all its might. But in 1919, Britain finally had to leave Afghanistan and give independence to the Afghans. After that, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. His intention was to prevent the fall of the communist regime established by a coup in 1978. But it took them 10 years to realize that they would not win this war. The British Empire and the Soviet Union have one value in common. Both empires were at the height of their power when they invaded Afghanistan. But with this attack, both the empires gradually started to fall apart. In 2001, the US-led invasion of Afghanistan resulted in the deaths of millions of people in the war that lasted for several years. 20 years after this attack, US President Joe Biden withdrew his troops from Afghanistan has decided to recall. It was a controversial decision that was heavily criticized around the world. Because of this one decision, the Taliban has captured the Afghan capital Kabul very quickly. Biden defended his decision, saying that American citizens should not die in a war that Afghans are not prepared to fight themselves. Recalling Afghanistan's reputation as the graveyard of empires, Biden said, "A stable, united and secure Afghanistan is not possible no matter how much military force is deployed." Afghanistan has been a graveyard for the world's most powerful armies trying to control Afghanistan in recent centuries. In the beginning, these attacks and armies may have had some success. But in the end they had to flee Afghanistan. Defense and foreign policy analyst David Asby, author of the book Afghanistan, Graveyard of Empires on the History of Afghanistan, told BBC Mundo, "It's not that the Afghans are powerful enough. But what has happened in Afghanistan is due to the mistakes of the invading forces. If viewed objectively, Afghanistan is a difficult place," says Isby. "It is a complex country with poor infrastructure, very limited development and a landlocked region." However, Isby says that neither the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom nor the United States have shown flexibility with Afghanistan. They wanted to go their own way and they did. But they never went to Afghanistan. "I did not understand the current complications. It is often said that Afghanistan it is impossible to conquer. This is a false statement. Iranians, Mongols and Alexander conquered Afghanistan. But it is certain that it is a boldness that has a price to pay. And the last three major empires that have attacked Kabul before have failed miserably in their attempts. For most of the 19th century, Afghanistan was a major crucible in the war between the British and Ravi empires for control of Central Asia. This led to decades of diplomatic and political conflict between Russia and Great Britain, with Britain eventually winning. But Britain had to pay a heavy price. Britain invaded Afghanistan 3 times between 1839 and 1919, and it can be said that Britain failed all 3 times. In the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839, the British occupied Kabul. because Britain believed that if it did not take this step, Russia would occupy Kabul. Due to this, Britain suffered a historic defeat. Some tribes destroyed the army of the most powerful country in the world with very meager weapons. Drama Queen, listen to the podcast. The things that are not shared with anyone, episode content. After almost 3 years of invasion, Afghanistan has finally forced the invading army to flee. On January 6, 1842, out of the 16,000 soldiers who left the British camp for Jalalabad, only one British citizen returned alive. Issy says that this war weakened the British expansionist policy in the subcontinent and also damaged the perception that the British were invincible. After 4 decades, Britain tried again. This time he had some success. Also read, what will be the future of Afghanistan's economy fed by Saudi Arabia? What are the sources of income of the Taliban who have been fighting the United States for 2 decades? Will the Panjshir Valley be able to withstand the advance of the Taliban? And as a result of the Second Anglo-Afghan War between 1878 and 1880, Afghanistan became a British protectorate. But Britain is resident in Kabul. His policy of remaining a minister had to be abandoned. Instead, the British Empire elected a new Afghan AMIR and withdrew its troops from the country. But in 1919, when this new AMIR declared himself independent from Britain, the Third Anglo-Afghan War began. It was a time when the Bolshevik Revolution reduced the Russian threat and the First World War greatly increased British military spending. In such a situation, interest in Afghanistan decreased in the British Empire. For this reason, after 4 months of war, Britain finally declared Afghanistan independent. Although Britain did not have an official presence in Afghanistan, it is believed to have maintained its influence there for many years. During the year 1920, Abna Amir Amanullah Khan tried to reform the country. These included ending the practice of women wearing the burqa. These reformist efforts angered some tribes and religious leaders, leading to a civil war. Due to this civil war, the situation in Afghanistan remained tense for several decades, and in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to keep a badly organized communist government in power. Several Mujahideen organizations opposed the Soviet Union and against them. In this war, Mujahideen got money and weapons from America, Pakistan, China, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Russians launched ground and airstrikes on areas and villages they believed were the root of the problem. Due to this, the local population was forced to leave their homes or die. There is a lot of blood in this attack. About 1.5 million people died in this war and 5 million people became refugees. For a time, the Soviet Union army was able to control major cities and towns. But in the rural areas, Mujahideen roamed relatively freely. The Soviet Union's military tried to eradicate extremism in many ways, but guerrilla fighters often escaped such attacks. The entire country was destroyed in this war. Meanwhile, then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev realized that the Russians could not continue the war while trying to transform the economy and decided to withdraw his troops in 1988. But the image of the Soviet Union could never be improved by this withdrawal. Afghanistan became the Vietnam War for the Soviet Union. It was a very costly and humiliating war in which the Soviet Union, despite putting all its might into it, was defeated by the local guerrilla fighters. It is said that the Soviet Union claimed the legitimate government in Afghanistan at a time when there was serious and fundamental conflicts between its government and its military within the Soviet system. This was one of the biggest mistakes of the Soviet Union. After that, the Soviet Union began to disintegrate and disintegrate. After the failed efforts of the British and Soviet empires in Afghanistan, the United States came to Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks to support democracy in Afghanistan and eliminate Al-Qaeda. Previous to, the US was able to quickly conquer Kabul and force the Taliban to surrender. The Afghan government came into being 3 years later, but the Taliban attacks continued. Former US President Barack Obama in 2009, a troop surge pushed back the Taliban. But it did not last long. 2014 saw the bloodiest year since the war began in 2001. NATO forces completed their mission, and the responsibility was handed over to the Afghan army. Because of this, the Taliban took over more areas. The next year saw a series of suicide bombings. Among them were explosions near Kabul's parliament and the airport. Accordingly, many things went wrong in the US invasion. He says, one of the many problems, despite military and diplomatic efforts, was that the US and the international community could not stop Pakistan from waging a proxy war, which proved to be successful. And it proved to be more successful than other weapons. The war in the Soviet Union resulted in more bloodshed, but the Reiki attack proved more costly. If the Soviet Union spent $2 billion annually in the war in Afghanistan, the US spent only $2 billion annually between 2010 and 2012. But the fall of Kabul has also been compared to events in South Vietnam. Republican Congressman Stefanik tweeted, "This is Joe Biden's Saigon. International is waiting, although about 100 billion D." A disastrous failure at Nama that will never be forgotten. After the withdrawal of American troops, the Taliban occupation has created a kind of humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, due to which millions of people have been displaced. Azam says that it will be important to see in the coming days whether the Taliban government will be approved by the international community. I have a lot of doubts on this matter. And if it becomes impossible for the international community to deal with the Taliban, it will be interesting to see if any other power will attack Afghanistan. The graveyard of the world's empires takes risks.